I was sitting peacefully at home in my apartment in Brooklyn when what came across the internet, but WebMD, 10 signs you might be a sex addict. So I thought, well, things have really progressed. They've really come down the trail. And I thought they're so open to this idea. We're really in a good place. But that first title was a little misleading. They're still deciding if sex is really a real addiction.
Who's they?
They is WebMD is a website that dispenses bromides and information about medicine, always supposedly well informed. They'll say this post was cleared by, and then they'll list some.
And what suggested they're still mulling over the idea that sex is an addiction? I didn't see it in that article, but maybe I missed that.
Well, they said 10 signs you might be a sex addict implies, well, sex addict is a thing. Sort of like they have a million articles. You can get pretty paranoid reading the websites. 10 signs you might have, uterine cancer, or 10 signs. Right. So, but it turns out they're not totally committed to really believing that, because there's a following article called Break the Habit, 10 Ways to Help Tame Your Soft Addictions. Uh-oh. You don't usually get soft cancer and hard cancer and soft heart disease and hard heart disease. So what are soft addictions? Do you know?
They say soft addictions are things like shopping or I forget what else, but you see the point. Some process that you might do.
One they would call it.
And hard addictions, they say it's not hard addictions like heroin or smoking or drinking. Like the thing is the addiction, alcohol use, addiction. So shopping, soft addiction.
The history of addiction, I wrote a book called The Meaning of Addiction, 1985. And the distinction used to be physiological addiction or dependence and psychological dependence and addiction.
Right.
And they used to have only two things in physiological addiction: heroin and alcohol, which is already complicated because they didn't really believe alcohol was like heroin. Nobody believed that. Alcohol, because they knew a lot of people drank, but heroin was just addictive. And then throughout starting in the 1980s, they declared that cocaine was an addiction. They sort of announced it. A lot more people were using it. But, cocaine's been around. At the time, cocaine had been around a century and longer. So it took them 100 years to figure out cocaine was addictive. And of course, you're imagining, they must have laboratories at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and they're doing late night research. And they suddenly discovered in the brain that cocaine was addictive.
So wait, now can we back up? Because I think if I'm a listener, if I'm a viewer at the onset, I might be confused about your observation. So to recap, WebMD has put out an article about sex addiction. You might be addicted to sex if, and then they give 10 things. WebMD also has put out things that suggest they believe if something's an addiction, you can view it, calibrate it, measure it, see it in the brain. So there's a distinction between what they're saying about sex addiction. Here are things in regular life that might make you sex addicted, and other things that they're calling an addiction, like drugs, because drugs obviously cause addiction, dopamine, brain scans, la, la, la.
And the brain scans is a recent addition. What's really been happening is we used to believe that one drug caused addiction. Then we believed drugs caused addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And we expanded the marketplace of drugs. We went from heroin to cocaine in the 1980s. And then we included tobacco. in the 1980s. And we didn't used to believe cocaine was addictive because it doesn't have the same profile as heroin. And we didn't believe smoking was addictive because, well, a lot of people smoked and they were like normal people. And so there's a shifting definition of addiction. And underlying it all is this idea that never disappears in the United States. Well, addiction is something in the brain. And it's a quick link from that thought to thinking, well, drugs affect the brain. And substances, they're the real addictions. So that's sometimes called physiological addiction or physiological dependence. Neither term is used anymore.
Right.
And then, so they're backing up. Well, we're not allowed to say, well, there's physiological addiction and psychological addiction. So we'll call hard addiction and soft addiction. Ironically, we're getting vaguer and vaguer about what's going on. So let me trace. We've given a brief history of addiction. And in the 1990s, by the way, they started talking about marijuana being addictive. Now, that's a tough sell for a lot of people because marijuana is good and heroin is bad. And now we're in an era where even that's being debated. Well, drug policy reform says, well, people do take opioids. Carl Hart's the most strongest exponent of the idea. Where do we decide these drugs are okay and these drugs are good? And he comes down against the drug policy reform movement. So I'll just pick out one victim. A friend of mine who I was present, I was on a panel discussing addiction. His name is Early Wine. Is that his name? And he wrote a whole book about marijuana. And it was a book about marijuana being okay. And, people in our era and people like Ethan Nadelman, they like a book like that. Mitch Earlywine's his name. And one of the things he says is that marijuana, of course, isn't addictive. What's he mean? When he says marijuana is addictive, what's he really saying?
When he says marijuana is not addictive, what is he saying?
Yes.
It's not like the other hard drugs.
He's saying, well, there's hard drugs. They're really addictive. And then there's marijuana. And so Ethan Edelman's a split personality. He welcomed my point of view. He invited me into his world in 1985 after reading The Meaning of Addiction. But he likes Mitch Earlywine because he's trying to legalize marijuana. Mm-hmm. But Mitch Earlywine, bless his soul, a wonderful man, is a reactionary. He's sort of saying, well, there's addiction, and that's heroin, but then there's marijuana. And of course, somebody who's reacted to that whole distinction is Carl Hart. So in a way, we're still reifying misconceptions about what addiction is. And I mean, Mitch Earlywine has no idea about what's going on in the brain, but he's fantasizing just the same way that Nora Volkow's fantasizing. Well, there's something that we're going to see in the brain that's addiction. Boom. So we've had a brief history of addiction here. Used to just be heroin and sort of alcohol. Then in the 1980s, they added cocaine and then they added tobacco. And now in 1990s, with a lot of stiff resistance, they've added marijuana. So there's a document called DSM-5, it's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Now, WebMD is not a radical operation. It's not the Thomas Saz website where they say, oh, addiction's fantasy bullshit. But they never refer to DSM-5, which is the official diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which is an official division of the American Medical Association. What? Why don't they even mention DSM-5 or their definitions of addiction, would you think?
Oh, I don't know. They're doctors, not psychiatrists. I don't know.
So maybe doctors think the psychiatry is bullshit. Maybe doctors think DSM-5 is bullshit. On the other hand, look at it in an entirely different direction. Maybe DSM-5's thinking is too advanced. People are writing a website. Because here's what DSM-5 actually does. I've mentioned this quite a few times. DSM-5 doesn't use the word soft addiction or hard addiction. DSM-5 doesn't actually use the term addiction in relationship to drugs. DSM-5 names one thing in the universe addictive. One thing. I'm going to refer to God a lot in this little discussion, so forgive me. God decided one thing in human experience is addictive. Gambling. That's how after 1,000 years or 5,000 years of human civilization, after 100 years of psychiatry, one thing is labeled addictive. They have substance use disorders and addictive substance use and addictive behavior disorders. So it's an addictive behavior, but that's the only thing it calls addictive. But WebMD doesn't bother with all of that. They're back to soft and hard addictions. Now, DSM-5 is actually, in a sense, that's psychotic. What can I tell you? Well, there's one thing in the universe that's addictive. That's impossible. It defies logical common sense. On the other hand, what I like about DSM-5, it's a harm reduction document. It doesn't say if you take heroin, or opioids regularly that you're addicted. It doesn't say that. It has a list of 8 criteria of problems, experiential and behavioral, that makes something addictive or not addictive. Isn't that kind of useful? Because you can take those set of criteria and apply them to any drug, really. Like how discombobulated will you become if you stop taking it? Do you take more and more of it? Does it disrupt your life more? Does it cause legal problems? Does it cause relationship problems? And you could take those criteria and you could apply them to any overwhelming habitual experience.
Which is what WebMD did with this sex addiction, 10 ways you might be a sex addict article.
Exactly so. They're reinventing the wheel. We'll go into some of the criteria they use. DSM-5 says you're only in this volume if you have distress and impairment. You have to be psychologically distressed by something or impaired by something. But I like DSM-5 because it doesn't accept the psychotic view. So going back to DSM-5, DSM-5 explicitly, they had a study group headed by Charles O'Brien, and they explicitly rejected the idea that sex was an addiction. They didn't not consider it. They considered it, and then they rejected it. They claim that there are certain alpha brainwaves that correspond to addiction, which is a psychotic delusion. Because, and if they don't list heroin, cocaine, alcohol, marijuana as causing addiction, do they create those brainwaves? Those alpha brainwaves? And so then how do they decide sex isn't an addiction? Because sex doesn't create those brainwaves. What does create those brainwaves? And they decide that gambling creates it, which is all delusional thinking, with all due respect to the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. But why do a lot of people think sex is addictive? I'm going to throw this back at you, Zach. You're a regular human being and a clinician and a person who deals with people. Why do people call sex addictive, would you say?
Practical, reasonable reasons, or shooting from the hip reasons? What are you thinking right now?
Why do psychologists why would a psychologist, if you ran into some clinician, and you know several, why would they say sex can be addictive? What would their explanation be?
Because people do it and it completely disrupts their lives.
Right. So simple, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You're a psychologist, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you didn't have that experience in your own life, but then you get clients. There are people who kill themselves and kill other people because of sex addictions. There are people that burn down dance clubs out of their desire for somebody that rejects them. There are people who never recover from a relationship that they were committed to that fell apart or that was rejective of them. There are people's whole lives are destroyed all the way down to the grassroots. And so if we were talking to WebMD, we'd say, oh, so those are soft addictions? You know, I used to have a bunch of cases. There were two identical twins who were dating the same guy. And one of the identical twins, two women, stabbed her sister in the heart and killed her. That's a negative consequence, killing your identical twin sister and going to jail for the rest of your life because of your attraction to another person that in some way is not functional. Would a WebMD say, well, here's a soft addiction. Look, she killed her twin sister and was in prison for life. What's soft about it? And what's soft about the idea that some people decide they can't live after an addictive relationship evaporates?
Well, that's why to fix that engineering problem, that's why people like Gabor Mate, people who have okay, so someone's shopping must not have led them to do this heinous thing. It must be something else, and you can identify something like a deep trauma or something like that. So you can pivot and hide the ball, pass it some other lane. So it keeps that theory about soft addictions alive.
Well, exactly right, because what they'll say about, if you say what they used to say about cigarettes and cocaine, and what they would still say about caffeine, is they would say, well, lots of people take it and they don't kill themselves.
Right.
But millions of people take opioids and don't kill themselves.
Right.
So they have created the heart addiction that they imagine is a fantasy, a delusion. And then they're measuring the real experience they may have with other substances and involvements like marijuana. Well, hardly anybody gets totally caught up with marijuana. Well, Mitch Early went, bless his soul. I lectured to his class at USC, and a young woman came up to me afterwards and she said, I went to rehab for marijuana, but you're never, ever allowed to say that in this class. Mitch Early was he's in Syracuse University now. He's a famous lecturer. He really relates well to students. But she said he would never tolerate you saying that marijuana could be addictive. And what he's thinking is, Mr. Earlywine has never shot up heroin. He's thinking, well, look, most people I know take marijuana, they're fine. I take marijuana, I'm fine. Heroin, and then he casts marijuana against what he envisions heroin to be, and he's as stuck in myths as any other human being.
Yeah.
So how come, clinicians encounter people, sometimes they're shocked by it, whose lives are completely absorbed or destroyed by gambling. That was like a discovery. They created a whole addictive gambling thing in the 1990s, or shopping or sex. People have written 1 million books about sex addiction now. They're famous, where they say, I discovered sex was addictive. Here's what happened in my life. And then they tell the story of their addiction. And so I thought, well, WebMD is dealing with the reality that sex is addictive. That's before we got to how to get over a soft addiction. So here's their definition. So after all this falderall, if you're talking about addiction, you sometimes are forced to descend to the level of common sense. This is what WebMD says.
So we're back to the WebMD article about sex addiction. You
Yes.
might be a sex addictive. Okay.
If you're a sex addict, you may find yourself having sexual fantasies, thinking about sex, or feeling driven to engage in sexual behavior, even when it's inappropriate. You might say, when it's inappropriate, when it's dysfunctional, when it's extremely destructive, even leading up to self-harm and harming others. They don't have that. They stop it. It's inappropriate. Because that sounds kind of soft. And here's their next section. Sexual compulsions may lead to severe consequences, like financial, health, or legal problems. And that's a soft addiction. What kind of health problems? Legal problems, Well, that one woman killed her sister and went to jail for life. That would fall in that category. So then they list 10 ways. So that definition, if you asked your mother or your grandmother, if your grandmother were alive, when is a sexual or a love relationship bad? They'd say if it hurts you, if you're so involved in it and the other person isn't responding in a positive way, if they harm you, if the relationship destroys your connections to other people, if your involvement with the relationship causes you to do negative and dangerous things to your own body and to your own life, and then you're kind of saying, well, that's the definition of addiction. And so, although WebMD never mentions DSM-5, they then give a list of examples. They get 10 things that sound an awful lot like the things that DSM-5 lists. DSM-5 calls it substance use disorders, and they have 8 criteria, and there are mild, moderate, or severe, which I like. They don't say something is addictive or non-addictive. They say something is more or less negative and impairing and distressing, which is sort of the way human beings work, isn't it? They don't have an all or nothing addictive experience. They have a better or worse one, and it can vary. So they give 3 examples of what I said at the beginning of DSM-5. They have distress and impairment. 3 of the criteria are: do you feel out of control? Do you feel guilty? Another way of saying that is, do you feel distress as a result of engaging in the habit? Do you, after you've lost a lot of money gambling, after you've had a sexual encounter, after you've had a connection to a person who may be abusing you, do you feel bad? And do you keep sexual secrets? That's an interesting criterion, Then they give examples of harm. Then the rest of the list is the example of harmful things people do as a result of sex. Do you spend money on sex you don't have? Well, isn't that how you decide that you're sort of a heroin addict or an alcoholic?
You spend money that you don't have on sex. Okay, I had to think about listening to it, I had to think about how that grammatically worked.
It is a bad sentence. In other words, do you have financial problems because of your addiction?
Right.
Because of sex? That's kind of a crucial criteria of gambling addiction. Is sex causing relationship problems? How can sex cause relationship? Well, you could be having sexual relationships outside of your primary loving relationship, supposedly, and that's causing you problems. Or it can be causing you problems within that relationship. Is it causing you legal problems? These are criteria that they list. Legal problems are among the things that listed in DSM-5. If you get arrested for stealing or drunk driving or getting in fights, that's a legal problem that's caused by your substance, which they don't call addictive. It's a substance use disorder. Do you have unsafe sex? Well, if you get AIDS by having inappropriate sexual partners and unprotected sex, is that a soft addiction? Because that would be pretty, if you die as a result of a sex addiction, that's a serious consequence. And then they have that are you preoccupied by sex? Which gets you back, I mean, how do you know? So that's a combination of a behavioral and a distress factor. So what they do after they draw this soft and hard distinction, after they imply, well, we're going to talk about sex addiction, and everybody knows what we mean. And then they give a definition that's obvious and commonsensical, and which is, in fact, essentially the same definition given by DSM-5. They then say, oh, but we're only talking about soft addictions. And so reading this, I'm thinking, well, the world, DSM-5 came out in 2013. DSM-5 declared that sex was not an addiction. Exactly 10 years later, in 2022, WebMD refers to sex addiction and gives you a way of deciding whether you have a sex addiction. Have we advanced in those 10 years, would you say, Zach? Or what?
In a way, yes. In a way, no.
Spell that out. I agree.
I mean, it's nice. At first glance, I'm reading this 10 things you might want to look at in your life. I mean, the way I read it is sex addictive, or otherwise, is sex actually a problem in your life? And here are 10 things you might want to look at. Well, good. We've come far enough that we're spelling out that something like an addiction means these things in your life. And then, of course, no, because in a WebMD sort of bad engineering model, they're saying, well, sex can be a soft addiction. And if you're softly addicted to something like sex, then look out for these things. But it's not going to give you that brain disease, not going to give you that flood of overflood of dopamine like some other kind of drug, like a heart addiction. And so in that way, it's been a brick wall that we've never advanced beyond.
In a way, we're having the same debate. So when I first read 10 Ways of Telling You're a Sex Addict, I thought, well, the world has moved, as I often describe, in the 1960s, when the Department of Health and Human Services, HEW, declared that smoking causes cancer, they actually had a chapter saying smoking wasn't addictive. Now, every human being in the United States would say, well, source smoking is addictive. And what they think happened is they looked in the brain and they saw when people smoked, something addictive happened in their brain. But what really happened is we changed how we accommodate and think about addiction. That's what happened. And so when I'm looking at 13, and they say, well, sex isn't addictive, and of course, their explanation is it doesn't cause alpha brainwaves. They're sort of saying, well, this is a new idea. It sounds strange. And then when I read how you can tell if you're a sex addict, I thought that in these 10 years, we had come down the pike. Everybody's aware that sex is something that can be addictive. It's not something that you even need to discuss. But then just the way you point out, we've hit that same brick wall, which is, well, only a drug can be addictive. I don't, to hell with what DSM-5 says, because that's hard. It affects your dopamine and it affects your brain. And sex doesn't affect your dopamine and your brain. Of course, that's a ridiculous distinction. And so we can either, and I don't know the answer to this, decide that we've come a long way. Every clinician in the United States, every clinician has some concept of dealing with sex addiction. Everybody who's dealt with human beings and clients. On the other hand, we still have these artificial distinctions based on imaginary categories that tell us, well, that's not really an addiction. We call it an addiction, but it's not a real addiction. And so alternately, the two theories we have is that we've really come away to understanding what addiction really is, and we're able to apply it to sex, or we're still hunkered down without a clear view of what really makes for addiction. Now, in our life process program, all of those, we don't draw any of those, we don't have a term soft and hard addiction. We embody what DSM-5 says. How much distress is something causing you, and how much is it impairing your life? Those are the only meaningful criteria for determining how healthy or unhealthy an involvement is.
Well put. I'm just struggling to imagine. I think about daily conversations that I have with people, and that's such a simple concept that we're going back and forth about. People believe that addiction is something that happens to your brain, no matter how much you say this.
Now, clinician, would you say that, I know clinicians who understand that sex is addictive. Is that a fair statement? The clinicians, are more aware of the possibilities and likelihood of that. Wouldn't you agree?
And the best clinicians that I know, for instance, somebody asked me for what do you call it? Referral the other day. They said, well, who would you suppose that we could talk to about our son and drugs and possible addiction? Although I think the balance in his life is okay for now, but we're worried that it's going in a direction. And I said what I always say, they're thinking about counseling for him or maybe for them. And I said, the best people I ever talked to have nothing to do with having like an addiction background. The most sensible people who speak to these problems, real life problems, are people who are, yes, clinicians, but who work with a person in their regular, normal, non-disease imaginary lives.
It's almost like it's like you would like to unreal everything the people know about addiction, all those people you talk to in the street, and say, can't we just ask a common sense question about what a person's involvement is like and how they relate to something or somebody and what impact it's having on them? We've spent close to 100 years creating a field of addiction medicine and addiction psychology, which is filled with misconceptions and makes us less capable of A, recognizing reality, and B, dealing with it. And so I'm reading this WebMD list of, are you an addict? And here's how to deal with solve addiction. And we still haven't really unfurled those harmful, imaginary, almost psychotic distinctions that we've created.
But we're from the ground up saying, look, you have a problem and you think it's something like an addiction. We're saying, does it impair in your life? Is it causing distress? Let's work from there and figure out what you can do practically on balance
without backwards.
Without the fear of that. Right. Well, I think the thing is, people worry about.
DSM-6 is not going to say, oh, sex isn't addictive, and oh, gambling and we said it was addictive, but it's not really. We're somewhere moving down that road. Yes.
Well, to see, but okay, I'm prolonging this, but my concern, of course, is that, right, they're not going to go backwards and say things aren't when they're saying that they are. But there's this like switch that we're worried about hitting, or a person hitting, where it's the brain thing. So I do worry that people could go backwards in that direction. Like, how are we going to navigate this, like telling people how to do things practically without getting in the way of the good fear that people have of this switch happening in their brain, because we don't want that to happen to people. So
now,
it could be.
So is a person the head of the NIMH, who was dedicated to biological approaches to medicine. He spent billions of dollars, American government, on those. And now that he's retired, he says, mental illness and mental disorders have gotten worse in that time period. Our mental health system doesn't work. That was entirely a mistake. And Americans are as committed or more committed as ever. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares what Thomas Insel thinks now. Our mental health outcomes are worse than ever, and our drug outcomes are worse than ever. And yet, we're still not able to get off of the imaginary idea that we're somehow going to find and fix in the brain these things. What can I say? We've laid out the two sides of things. These issues are constantly appearing before us. People are constantly saying commonsensical things. On the other hand, they're imagining distinctions and the existence of causes that are impossible to determine and that we know nothing about. And we're still balancing those two things in our hands. And we're committed to the idea of dealing in a practical way with people's real life conceptions and real lives. That's what we're trying to do, and that's how we measure our success.
Amen. Happy Sunday, Stanton.
Happy Sunday.